John, I will start. I'm older than you.
Yes, you are.
And that gives me the privilege of speaking before you. The format, I think, is I'm more or less asking John questions. I'm hoping I only have to ask him one or two questions, and he will run with that. And you can listen to John, who's a wonderful person to listen to, and I enjoy. Every time I go to one of your talks, John, usually interviewed by some bright person, much brighter than me, and I'm a bit intimidated by the whole thing. But it's quite wonderful, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a big fan of John Hartman's. I met John for the first time. I was living in Toronto at the time, and I was working on this catalogue resume of my father's paintings. I had a room in the old Robertson Chocolate Factory, which is on Queen Street at Jarvis and runs from Queen actually down to Richmond. And it was full of semi-legitimate people such as myself and photographers and artists and antiquarian bookstores and things like that. It was a great place to work. And John came along one day and introduced himself. He may have phoned me first, I don't remember. And this would be in the early 80s. And said he was interested in my father's paintings and knew the catalog resume was doing, knew I had images of just about everything, and came up. I don't know if you remember that, John, but I remember it very well. Yeah. And that's the first time I met John. I'm a minor collector of John's work. I have 4 prints and a wonderful pastel of mountains, which I love. And I see John off and on. So, and before I say any more, I want to thank Nicholas and Sarah and the staff, the team at the Mativia Gallery. You've done a superb job with this show. I think I'm talking first of all with the dry points. It's the first time I've seen some of my father's dry points hanging for quite a long time. And the Hartmans are wonderful paints there. And this show is a knockout. Wow, I love it. It's terrific. So, John, I know we're going to speak about prints for a while, but you've got to say some words about this painting before we stop too. So we'll get rid of the prints first, and then we'll do that. And I want to, I think, start with what my father called subject pictures or fantasy pictures. And he started doing this in about 1940, about the time I was born, actually. And he did often with biblical themes, usually with some humor. To the point even he did a series of paintings about Jonah returning from his voyage inside the whale. And he was arriving at Union Station in Toronto, Jonah was, and the reporters were taking pictures and so on of Jonah coming back from his voyage with the whale. Others, a lot of ascensions and so on. And John's work, and I think most of you here are, as I am, fans of John Hartman's, or you wouldn't be here probably. And John, your work, I don't want to say echoes, but uses the same devices, particularly in some of your earlier dry points, but throughout your work. And we're sitting beside 2 of them, and maybe I'll speak for 1 more minute, and then you speak. This little dry point here, which is a unique example, by the way. There's a single color version of it and a drawing, and this one is called The Saint. And everyone assumes the saint is St. Francis. And you can see him just in front of the giraffes and behind another elephant with a monkey on the elephant's tail. And my father said he thought it would be St. Francis, but then found out that St. Francis was more a bird lover. My lady friends, I think he called the birds, and he went to preach with them. So my father thought maybe the saint would be St. Jerome, but he didn't know much about St. Jerome. He probably saw images of St. Jerome taking a thorn out of a lion's paw, which was one of the myths about St. Jerome. So it's a nameless saint. Rosemary Tavel, who was mentioned in the introduction, thinks it's somewhat an image of my father. My father was not rotund at all. He was a very slender man. He was bald, however, so maybe that was it. In this case, my father has created a forest scene with St. Francis, but not altogether forest. There's a porcupine and there's a goose and there's a rabbit, but there are also giraffes and elephants and monkeys. So it is truly a fantasy, if you will. And as the years went by, for the last 12 years of his life, I think these pictures were the most important thing for him. He thought they were, eventually. He wrote my mother fairly late in his painting life and said, this is all that matters now. And he was doing these fantasies. Now, John.
Well, in the late 70s and early 80s, just, at the beginning of my own career, I began to realize that I would like to, as much as I love landscape painting, sort of in the tradition of the Canadian artist who painted landscapes, every time I sat in one, I was also aware of the history of that spot and my own personal history and other people's. And I began to realize that I wanted to I might want to combine these two things. And in doing that, you have to look for a form, like a way to do it. And there were hardly any examples in Canadian art. The only one I could really think of in Canadian art were these late fantasy paintings of Milne's. And if I thought of other examples outside of Canada, I would have to go to someone like Stanley Spencer in Britain. And the one thing that Milne and Spencer had in common was they would take a kind of universal theme, or sometimes specifically even a biblical theme, like a resurrection, and put it in the spot that they knew best. So Spencer would paint the resurrection in Cookham. Milne puts the saint in his bush camp with the tent there and some of the animals that he might see in the bush camp, but then he just throws in other elements from the story, and he puts them all together into one image.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's the element in your dad's work that really attracted me, was that I thought I can take these places I knew really well and the stories I knew about them and put them together, but that I somehow was going to have to float the images of people and the stories in the sky, either above the landscape or between the viewer and the landscape. And for that to work, there had to be the viewer had to kind of either suspend their disbelief or realize there was not so much a fantasy element to it, but a fantastic element to it, something beyond what was ordinary. So that, there were 2 points to take off from Milne. One was the subject matter, but then the other was there was no one else who was doing dry points, color dry points that I knew of. I've found other artists since, but there was really only Milne who was doing color dry points. So I was looking at him for subject matter, but also for the kind of technical things he was doing as a printer.
Yes, and I'd like to speak, I'd like you to speak a little bit about some of the origins of that without getting overly technical, because we don't have your technical skills, most of us in the audience, but I'd like to hear some. But before doing that, I'd like to ask you, John, about, and relate this to Milne as well. Almost all the imagery of my father's subject pictures or fantasy pictures had a religious background. It came from the biblical stories. I never knew my father ever to go to a church, and apart from when he was in England after World War II and was painting on a hillside and looked down on the village and heard a service and loved the music and went down and stood in the church, I don't think he went to church. I think when he lived at home with his mother in the Bruce County, and in Paisley in Bruce County. There probably was never a Sunday when he didn't go to church. His mother, the story was, and it may well be true, that she grew up in Aberdeenshire in Scotland. She was a shepherdess by the age of 8 on the hillside of Benahee, which is a large mountain close to where she lived. And she learned to read by reading the Bible, and then read the Bible every day of her life. And that's probably true that she did. They were staunch Presbyterians, emigrated to Canada when she was about 30 years old in 1870. And so that would be a strong influence on my father in those days, and maybe a reason he never went to church thereafter, I don't know. But it was important to him. And I want to find out from John, because his imagery is religious in some point in the sense we say it's religious, but and I don't know if you're a churchgoer, and I don't care, but I do care where some of that, or I'm interested in where some of that imagery comes from that you use, and how you incorporate that into the scenes that you do incorporate into.
Well, mostly it comes from the fact that to the extent I have religious experiences, I have them in nature by myself generally. So every once in a while there's something happens. I'm out paddling a canoe, or I'm doing something, and I feel like all of a sudden there's I sort of entered into a moment where there's a unity of the spiritual world and the profane world. They're there all at once. It's like, and there are stories in the Western tradition that are kind of metaphors for that. Jacob's ladder, is a point at which the ordinary world and the spiritual world are united at one moment. And so my next problem is how do you present that in a painting or in an etching? And so my choice was to simply take, the only sort of part of the Western canon of art that deals with that are religious Christian paintings. At least that's what I'm aware of. So I just sort of turned to that imagery and said, I'll put that in, and then that sort of represents spiritual experience.
What reaction do you get from people with that?
Quite a varied reaction.
I'm sure.
For a lot of people, they don't understand. They don't understand why I'm doing it. Yeah. And I only hear about the reactions of people that decide they're going to pass them on to me.
Yes.
But the very first exhibition I had that had that subject matter in it, was at the Archive of Hamilton. Glenn Cumming organized it. They were big kind of almost very minimalist views of the landscape as if you're above it, and with tiny little figures, but it documented the Jesuit mission to the Wendat indigenous people in the 17th century, which occurred on the landscape I lived in Midland Penetanguishene.
Yes.
And some people loved it, like Grace Inglis, who was the art reviewer for The Spectator, thought it was a hugely important show. Other people were totally perplexed.
Yes.
So.
Yes. That's I think a similar experience that my father had.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think actually that the critical world and the art history world has not yet come to terms with those late paintings of your father.
They have not at all. No.
I think they've ignored them because they don't know how to deal with them.
Yes.
And I think that they're simpler. I think it's much simpler than people think. If you just listen to your explanation of how they occurred and what's going on in them. And I just think that they're a kind of bridge from Canadian landscape painting and the traditions of Canadian landscape painting into kind of postmodernism, into the group of painters that came along after abstraction in Canada and wanted to reintroduce representational subject matter. I'm just surprised that they continue to be ignored as much as they are.
They interesting enough, John, those fantasy pictures, particularly Ascensions. My father did 50 Ascension. Many of them canceled later, not by my father, but by his agent at my father's instruction or discretion. And some of them, I mean, they're beautiful. They're gorgeous pictures. There's soft watercolors, ascending figure here. It's really quite wonderful. There's nothing, he didn't do any dry point. There's Ascension here, but it's very different than the Ascension watercolors. And they were quite popular, and the National Gallery bought some, and major collectors and so on, if whatever you might call a major collector back in the 1940s and 50s. But and today, no one will touch them. You know, it's if they come, one comes to auction, it's almost, you know, like a disease. They don't want to go close to it. And I think it's like the dealer that I had for years before she died, Mira Goddard. And Mira, my father would paint black and paint churches. He liked to paint churches, and there's a wonderful dry point here of St. Michael's Cathedral, which is just up the street. And Mira said, probably quite correctly, said, people will not buy churches, they won't buy black paintings. Bingo, like that. And that's a business person's viewpoint. I mean, she wasn't putting the paintings down at all. She was doing she knew the collectors, and she knew what they wanted and what they didn't want. And my father's dealer at the time, Douglas Duncan, may have had some thoughts about these subject pictures or fancy pictures, but he was a strong personality, but my father was a stronger personality, so I don't think he said anything. Going from there, John, let's talk just very briefly about how you decided to use dry point and how you used dry point through the years, and what part of it has taken part in your prints. I'd like to just explore the Hartman, the printmaker, as opposed to Hartman, the painter. And I know you can't separate the two any more than you could with my father, but you can focus on one aspect or the other. And I just to lead further in our discussion, when we get to paintings, and I want to talk about that sort of aesthetic response an artist sometimes has. And printmakers don't have that kind of same, I don't think, but I don't know if they do. Have that way of
printmaking,
speed it up.
Yeah, it involves more planning.
Yes.
I mean, it's something with dry point and etching is the image has to go on the plate backwards. So that obviously involves planning. If you want it to be oriented the way the actual scene is, or the watercolor that you're basing it on is oriented, you have to put it on the plate backwards. And then with the case of color dry point, you have to make 2 or 3 separate plates, and those have to be registered so the things line up, so the little shadow that the building's throwing is beside the building, not 10 feet away from it. But the wonderful thing about dry point, and it's why I decided to, when I started making prints, to start off with dry point, is that it doesn't require acids to bite the plate. It's a much simpler operation that can be run at a different skill level than etching with acids in the copper plate. And the advantage that I had over your dad was that when I started in 1985, plexiglass had come along as a clear option for making a plate. So his late ones were done on Bakelite.
Yes.
Which didn't produce a good burr. So the dry point Buren makes a V and it throws a burr up, and that both the V and the burr catch ink when you're wiping the plate, and that prints, and that produces this rich line. There's a print of the stream in the woods in here of your dad's work that's got to be the first impression that was made from those plates, because the lines are incredibly rich. That burr eventually wears down. So, but plexi does throw up a good burr.
And you've used plexi always?
In the beginning I did.
Oh, okay.
And it also allowed me to register the plates much more quickly. I can see what, I don't have to make a counterproof from one print onto the other plate in order to know where my marks are. I just put one plate on top of the other. So it looked like a very simple and direct process. The other thing is, it's something that forces you to work by going ahead. You can't really take out a line in plexiglass, remove it, and burnish the plate down. Once it's there, it's there. So it's like painting in watercolor on wet paper. You're committed to every mark you make, and you have to solve any problem by going ahead, not backing up and trying to change something. And I love to work that way. That's my favorite way of working, is to force the process forward. So there were, for all those reasons, I like the idea of working in color dry point, and there simply wasn't anybody that I knew of that had picked up the tradition from your father and decided, okay, let's go with this. Printing, when I was starting to do it, was all large-scale, full-color lithographs or silk screens.
Yes.
Big, colorful things. And dry point is just a bunch of scratchy lines. And it works best if you don't try to fill it up with a lot of color. It works best if you leave lots of paper. So I looked very carefully at your father's prints. In fact, I went to the National Gallery after the exhibition that Rosemary Tavel had organized, and I made an appointment in the prints and drawing department, and I said I'd like to come for a couple of days and do nothing but look at Milne color dry points. And so the first morning I was there, I was in the department. I had my little gloves on, the white gloves they give you, and Rosemary wheeled out a cart, and it had cylinder boxes full of matted Milne dry points, and each box held about 10 prints, and there must have been 25 or 30 boxes. They were stacked up. I thought they were all going to fall over. And she said, "Where do you want to start?" And I said, "I'll start at the top box." And I just took them out, opened each one up, took the acid-free paper off them, lifted the top mat up, and I had a chance to look at every print they had right up close to try to understand how he was making these things. How did he get the plate tone? What was the technique? And then I went back home and started to work.
Wow. The experience of this is a little personal sidelight. I grew up with 4 dry points on our wall in our home. We lived in Uxbridge and then later in Bancroft. 3 of them are here: Main Street, Grain Elevator, and St. Michael's Cathedral, and the 4th was Adirondack Valley. And they were always there. It never really did much to me one way or the other. It was just part of my home. In the same way that my father being an artist was just part of my home. I kind of wished he was a truck driver because my friend's dad was a truck driver, and that was pretty cool. But that's the way it was. And it wasn't until 1968 when Douglas Duncan, my father's dealer, died, and I came into physical possession of the works that he held, that I sat down with my father's dry points in a box, many of them not even matted, and just did this. And I was just, all of a sudden, I was knocked out. It wasn't until that point in my life that I really felt, the feeling that you're all probably collectors, and if you're not, you're artists or you're into it. There's that moment with some art that it just touches you like this. And my father's dry point never had. But then they did in a big way.
Well, this group that's here on the wall are absolutely stunning together. That whole wall,
yes,
those are all absolutely remarkable prints.
Yeah.
And the strange thing is, one of them's even canceled.
Yes.
I didn't realize it was canceled till I got about this far from it, and there's a pencil X through it. And then what you explained to me, the sewing machine dots that he ran a sewing machine needle through it. It's a spectacular print, perfectly registered. I can't see why on earth he would have canceled it. But
How many times have you done that with your own?
well,
Yeah.
I think the thing with printmaking is you get very, very tuned into little minute details. And I've gone back and looked at things that I thought I shouldn't include in an edition or that were trial proofs. And I thought, why did I think it was a trial proof? Why didn't I just print it as that one was? So I can see how it might have happened. It's just that I can't, there's no information on that print that tells me why it would have been canceled. Because I've seen misregistered prints put in the edition
Yes.
by your dad.
Yes.
So obviously I think he must have just been looking at how did it feel?
He was, yes.
Not is it all perfectly done from a technical point
Yes.
of view.
Yes.
But that print of Blue Sky at Palgrave is spectacular.
The close to Blue Sky Palgrave, just around the corner here, are 3 samples of the first dry point that my father did. He first of all used little zinc plates, which were sold as roofing plates somehow at the local hardware store. And he borrowed his wife Patsy's darning needle and did that. It ran all over the place. He wrote to Clark and it didn't have any control and so on. But it's still, and then he used his neighbor's washing machine wringer, Mrs. Kay's washing machine wringer.
Which you can see because the prints are all creased because when they went through the wringer of the washing machine and there's no bed to the press, they just kind of got the same way that your shirt does when it goes through the wringer. It gets sort of pulled in weird positions.
Yeah.
So those are quite
Yeah.
remarkable that they worked at all.
They're worth knowing the background, having a little peek at. They're just around the corner. There are 3 of them mounted in one frame. But my point of that was that the progress from that was 1922, and Blue Sky Palgrave is probably 1930, 31, something like that. So maybe 9 years later, he came a long way.
There's a big jump in the technical ability,
Yes.
4 or 5 years after he
Yes.
started to do them.
In his case, it was really when he returned to Canada from the United States in 1929 and spent not a very happy winter, I think, in Weston, which was then a very separate little village outside of Toronto, in an old pump works. And I don't think he felt terribly settled and spent that winter pulling dry points, mostly. Did a bit of painting, but mostly that. John, you moved away from you answered very well from my question about the speeding up of an artist's creation when he's working at something. I know that my father felt that, and it was occasionally, bingo, you hit it. And I want to jump forward a little bit, and maybe we'll go back to dry points, but I want to, am I putting you on the spot too much to ask you to speak about one of the wonderful canvases in this exhibition and the creation of that canvas and your feeling as you created that? And was there a moment when things did speed up and you as my father said, occasionally when that happens, an artist can do no wrong. And my father was very self-critical. So usually the artist did wrong a lot. You have a very similar sensibility to my father in terms of nature and birds. This would be thrilling. My father's never owned a car, never learned to drive, never drove. A canoe was his transportation. And birds he identified and loved, and it was always a thrill for me when warblers came through and, oh, there's a blackbird and there's a this and there's a that and so on. And I know you have that same passion for what you see and for your surroundings. But translating that into art is a whole different thing. Speak a little bit, could you, about that?
Well, like your dad, I do an awful lot of preparatory work before I start to execute the painting. So I've got something that's caught my interest. In the case with these high water paintings, we'll take the one that's on the very back wall, which is called High Water at the Big River. And The big river empties into Georgian Bay about 100 yards from my cabin. And I began to realize with the high water that there was just an awful lot of animal and bird activity going on at the mouth of the river. So, and you know, this was not just me figuring this out. It was my son David and his friend Ashley. They're coming back from canoodle paddles around going, wow, we saw this, we saw that. So yeah, I began to fasten in on something as a possible subject matter. And then I think, okay, well, so I've got to collect, in this case, aerial shots that are taken from a drone for the landscape component. And then I sort of created a list of all the animals and birds I'd seen throughout the course of the summer going to this particular location. Then I had to get photographs of those individual birds and animals myself, collected at different times, sometimes, you know, one at a time on canoe trips when I'm there. So I've got all this collected, and then I start to do some watercolor studies of the birds and animals just to figure out how to paint them. And then the next step is to do a watercolor study that's about 22 by 30 inches of the composition, the final composition, which starts to combine all these things. And then when that's done and I'm happy with it, I get the canvas prepped and I draw it all out in red paint. And at this point, it's kind of, I'm just kind of, things haven't sped up. I'm just trying to get to the point that I've got a good composition, I've got everything in it that I want in it. I might spend time moving things around, and then I begin to actually paint it. And what has to happen is in the process of executing the painting, things have to go, it starts off very slowly, and it seems like I'm not moving very fast. And then at some point, it's like somebody hits the accelerator, and the whole painting starts to move more and more quickly. So the application of paint gets faster and faster, and at that point, if it all works, that it's the same thing your dad talked about, that you don't seem to be able to make a mistake. It just all kind of falls into place, but it falls into place because there's been a whole pile of preparation ahead of time, and that you've anticipated a lot of things that might be problems and avoided them. And if that happens at the end of a day and at the end of the painting, it's perfect. And if not, you go back in the next morning, especially with these big oils, and the process starts again. And usually for me, it's kind of slow from 9 o'clock till 11, and then sometime between 11 and 3, the whole thing starts to take off. But then, if the painting's not finished, I have to stop. And you know, I've run out of physical energy. And I don't try to make it go till 8 o'clock at night. I just say, I'll stop here, I'll come back the next day, but then it's got to all ramp up again.
And in that case, are you continuing to paint, or are you repainting it? Are you
No,
rubbing it out? Or?
Strangely enough, these paintings start at the top and go to the bottom.
Okay.
And
so that.
so it's like I said with the dry points. It's what you leave behind is finished.
Yes.
I mean, at the very end, there's some adjustments made. You know, another animal added, something scraped out, but nothing really major.
You sound, and from knowing you a little bit, you're clearly a disciplined person. In my father's case, he was as well. And my memory of him, this is in Uxbridge, where we had a nice house, which we rented for $17 a month always, and he had a studio on the main street, which he rented for $2 a month for 12 years. And he got up and we lit the fire and had breakfast, and probably at 8 o'clock he went down to his studio and took his lunch, or occasionally came home for lunch, and then worked and came home for 5 o'clock, and that was his day. In the evening, he would sit and look, he'd bring the day's work home and look at it and maybe discuss it with my mother if I was gone to bed. But he didn't go back to the studio at night or paint or do these sort of things. Do you do that at all?
No.
No, you don't.
No, it's very much like your dad's schedule. And I remember once reading, this was after the catalog raisonné came out. So the wonderful thing about the catalog raisonné is you can see it's organized from the first painting he did to the last one he did by day.
Yes.
Because everything was dated day, month, year. So when you look through that catalog raisonné, you're looking at the exact order in which he made his paintings.
Yes.
But he described his working method, and it was, he sort of circled the wagons for about 2/3 of the day,
Yes.
doing different things, getting ready mentally, but not actually painting. And then in the 2 hours, say between 2 and 4 o'clock, that's when the watercolor would happen. Mm-hmm. That often it was there was a kind of preparatory process,
Yes.
and then that allowed a fairly quick execution of the painting.
How many days a year do you think you paint?
Well, I go into the studio every day, but I don't.
Were you in your studio today?
Yes, but I was on the computer answering email. No, I was also
No,
I was also
I'm not-
downloading
wasn't funny.
photographs from yesterday.
Yeah.
So
So you're working every day?
yes,
Yes.
yes.
In my father's case, working was sometimes going for a hike or a picnic. Or,
Well, I call that work too. If it's I mean, if you ask my children or my grandchildren, I get up early at the island and go out and make a sketch or an oil sketch or a watercolor sketch or take some photographs first thing in the day before everybody's up, and I come back and kind of fuss around with those things until after lunch, and then they've all had breakfast and lunch, and then that's my day.
Yes.
for up there for the summer.
Yes.
And then we do family things in the afternoon and for dinner.
Yes.
But it's a very regular routine. I go out every day.
In my case, when I was young, and we camped up until I started going to school at the age of 6, then my father built a log cabin on Baptiste Lake, which I still have, and I live on the property next to it. And he never painted in those 2 months in the summer when my mother and I were there. It was always a project. We built a chimney one year. I was 7 years old, but never mind. But so that was what happened. That was building a little sleeping cabin for me, or doing this or doing that. And there was a fallow period where there was no painting at all. But you don't sound like you have fallow periods.
Well, no,
very much.
I do have them. I work, because of the pandemic, I had this huge big window of time that opened up in April, and I made a lot of work April, May, June. And then I kind of exceeded my monthly quota of energy. So July and August were more just collecting things and thinking about things.
Yes.
So I find that if I have a big burst of painting, then it's followed by a period of not actually making paintings, but thinking about
Do you ever paint from nature at all?
Yes,
You do?
yes.
Yeah.
And I tend to do that when I'm on trips to areas. When I first went to New Orleans, I started to do lots of on-site
Yeah.
watercolors. I always do it in Georgian Bay in the summer. But I also make images by seeing something and then letting it settle in and thinking about it, and going back and making photographs and then making studies and
Yeah.
building it up that way.
I've got one more question for John Hartman. When's the last time you did a dry point?
A straight dry point,
Yeah.
like on my own, not at a print shop with a.
Give me 2 answers, one on your own and one in a print shop.
It's been a while,
Okay.
but I do tend to work in bursts, so I sort of think it's time.
I think so too.
Yes.
I really do.
Thank you so much.